The moment you realize your own child doesn't want you in your own home anymore is a moment that quietly breaks something inside you. I remember that Sunday morning as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The church bells had just finished ringing as I walked down the front steps of St. Andrew's, the same little brick church I had attended for more than 30 years. The air carried that soft early fall chill we get here in Ohio, the kind that makes you pull your cardigan a little tighter, but still feels fresh and comforting. I had stayed a few minutes after the service to talk with my friend Linda about the bake sale coming up next weekend, and as I walked to my car I remember thinking how peaceful the morning felt. At 67 years old, peace had become something I appreciated more than anything else. My drive home took about 12 minutes, the same quiet route I had taken thousands of times before, past the gas station on Maple Street, the elementary school where my son Daniel once played on the swing set, and the little diner where my late husband Robert used to take me for pancakes every Saturday morning. Everything felt normal, ordinary, almost comforting in its routine. I turned onto our street, Maple Ridge Lane, a row of modest homes with trimmed lawns and old oak trees that shaded the sidewalks. I parked my car in the driveway like I always did, right beside the flower bed I had planted the spring after Robert passed away. I remember humming softly to myself as I stepped out of the car and grabbed my purse from the passenger seat. But the moment I looked up at the front porch, something didn't feel right. At first I couldn't quite place what I was seeing. There, sitting neatly beside the white rocking chair I liked to read in during the evenings, were two suitcases. My suitcases, the large navy one with the scuffed corner, and the smaller tan one I had used when I visited my sister in Michigan a few years ago. They were placed side by side like someone had carefully arranged them there. I stood in the driveway for a few seconds trying to make sense of it. Maybe Daniel and Ashley had taken them down from the attic for some reason. Maybe they were cleaning or rearranging things upstairs. But then I noticed the piece of paper taped to the handle of the navy suitcase. Even from a distance I could see my son's handwriting. My heart began to beat a little faster as I walked toward the porch, each step suddenly feeling heavier than the last. The wooden boards creaked under my shoes the way they always had, but that familiar sound no longer felt comforting. I reached for the note and carefully peeled the tape away. For a moment I just held the paper in my hand, staring at the handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for decades. Daniel had always had the same slightly slanted letters, the same way of pressing harder on certain words. I finally unfolded the note and read the short message written across the page. It only took a few seconds to read, but in that moment it felt like the entire world had gone completely quiet around me. The street was still, the wind had stopped moving through the trees, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing as I tried to understand how a peaceful Sunday morning had somehow turned into the moment my own son asked me to leave the house I had called home for more than 3 decades. For a long moment I just stood there on the porch holding that piece of paper, reading the same words again and again as if they might somehow change if I looked at them long enough. The note was short, only a few lines written in Daniel's familiar handwriting, but every word felt strangely distant, almost like it had been written by someone I did not know. He had written that things were not working anymore, and that he and Ashley needed space, and that it would be better if I found somewhere else to stay for a while. There was no anger in the words, no explanation, just a calm final tone that felt colder than anything else he could have written. I lowered the paper slowly and looked back at the 2 suitcases sitting on the porch, realizing that someone had packed them carefully. The navy one was zipped all the way closed and the smaller tan one had the luggage tag I had not used in years. I crouched down and opened the smaller suitcase just enough to see what was inside. Folded neatly were several of my sweaters, a few pairs of slacks, and the blue scarf my sister had given me last Christmas. Someone had gone through my dresser drawers and selected clothes as if they were preparing for a trip I never agreed to take. My hands rested on the edge of the suitcase while I tried to understand what was happening. Daniel and his wife Ashley had moved into the house with me about a year earlier after their apartment lease ended, and they wanted to save money for a place of their own. It had seemed like a simple arrangement at the time. The house was large enough, and I thought it might even be nice to have family around again after Robert passed away. The first few months had been peaceful. We shared dinners in the evenings, watched television together sometimes, and Daniel would occasionally help with things around the house like fixing a loose cabinet hinge or mowing the lawn. Ashley had always been polite, though a little distant, but I assumed that was simply her personality. Standing there on the porch now, with my suitcases placed beside the rocking chair I used almost every evening, those memories felt confusing and out of place. I slowly stood up again and looked at the front door. From where I stood I could see that the brass handle had been replaced with a newer one, shinier than the old one I had installed years ago. Something about that detail made my chest tighten. I walked toward the door and placed my hand on the knob, turning it gently the way I always did when I came home. The knob did not move. I tried again, a little firmer this time, but the door stayed locked. That was when the quiet realization settled over me that the locks had been changed while I was at church. I stepped back from the door and looked around the quiet street. Across the road Mr. Patterson was watering the flower beds in his front yard, completely unaware of what was happening on my porch. A car passed slowly at the end of the street and then everything was still again. I did not feel angry in that moment. I felt something closer to disbelief, like I had somehow stepped into someone else's life for a moment. I knocked lightly on the door, not because I needed to but because it was the only thing I could think to do. After a few seconds I heard movement inside the house, footsteps crossing the living room floor that I had vacuumed just the night before. The door opened a few inches and Ashley appeared in the doorway. She stood there quietly, her hand resting on the inside of the door as if she was careful not to open it too far. And for a brief moment neither of us said anything at all. Ashley looked at me with an expression that was calm but distant, the kind of look someone gives when they have already made up their mind about something and do not plan to change it. The door was still only open a few inches, just wide enough for me to see part of the living room behind her. The same beige sofa was there, the lamp on the side table was on, and the television screen reflected the quiet afternoon light coming through the window. Everything inside the house looked completely normal, which somehow made the situation feel even stranger. For a moment I thought she might say hello or explain what was going on, but instead she simply looked at the suitcases beside me and then back at my face. Her voice when she finally spoke was steady and polite, almost like she was discussing something ordinary. She said that Daniel had left the note, because they had been trying to figure out how to talk to me about this for a while. I felt the words settle in slowly, like pieces of a conversation I had somehow missed. I asked where Daniel was because hearing this from my daughter-in-law instead of my own son felt confusing in a way that I could not quite describe. Ashley hesitated for a second before stepping slightly to the side, and that was when I saw Daniel standing farther back in the hallway near the kitchen. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking down at the floor as if something there required all of his attention. My son was 38 years old, tall like his father, with the same brown hair he had when he was a boy running through this house with a toy truck in his hands. Seeing him stand there silently while I stood on the porch with my suitcases beside me made something heavy settle in my chest. I asked him if he had really written the note, even though I already knew the answer from the handwriting. He looked up briefly and nodded once before looking down again. The quiet between us stretched longer than I expected. I remembered all the small moments from years earlier, the mornings when I packed his lunch before school, the afternoons when I sat in the bleachers during his little league games, the long nights after his father passed away when I tried to be both parents at the same time. None of those memories seemed to fit with the moment happening now. Ashley spoke again and said that they had been thinking about their future, and that it would be easier if they had the house to themselves. She said they needed space to build their own life, and that this change would be better for everyone in the long run. The words sounded carefully chosen, almost rehearsed, like something she had practiced saying more than once. I listened quietly, trying to understand when this decision had been made, and why I had not seen it coming. I asked Daniel if this was really what he wanted. For a moment he looked like he might say something more, but instead he simply gave a small nod again. The movement was so slight that if I had blinked I might have missed it. Standing there on the porch, I realized that the house behind that door had slowly become something different from the home I remembered. The rocking chair beside the suitcases creaked softly in the breeze, and I could smell the faint scent of the roses I had planted along the walkway years earlier. Everything about the place still carried the memories of the life I had built here, yet the people standing inside the doorway seemed to be telling me that I no longer belonged there. For a few seconds I considered arguing or asking more questions, but the quiet certainty in Ashley's voice and the silence from my son told me that the decision had already been made long before I returned from church that morning. For several seconds none of us moved, and the quiet between the porch and the living Room felt heavier than any argument could have been. I looked at Daniel again, hoping that maybe he would step forward and say something different, something that would explain this moment in a way that made sense. Instead, he remained where he was, leaning slightly against the hallway wall, his shoulders tense and his eyes drifting between me and the floor as if he could not quite decide where to look. I realized then that whatever conversation had led to this decision had happened without me. Ashley cleared her throat gently and said that they had packed some of my things that morning, so I would have what I needed for a few days. She gestured toward the suitcases with a small movement of her hand, as if she were pointing out a simple travel arrangement rather than the fact that my belongings had been placed outside my own home. I followed her gesture and looked down again at the 2 bags sitting on the porch. The navy one had a small scratch along the side from a trip Robert and I had taken to Tennessee many years earlier, and seeing that mark suddenly brought back the memory of him lifting that same suitcase into the trunk of our car while laughing about how much I had overpacked. I let out a slow breath and felt a strange calm settle over me. It was not happiness or relief, but something quieter. The kind of calm that sometimes arrives when a person realizes that arguing will not change the direction of the moment. I asked Daniel one more time if he truly believed this was the best solution. He hesitated before answering, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face, but Ashley spoke before he could respond. She said they had talked about it for weeks, and that it was important for them to start building their own future without complications. Her tone remained polite, almost careful, but the message was clear enough. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed but because I understood that the conversation had already reached its end. The afternoon sun had shifted slightly while we stood there, and the shadow of the porch railing stretched across the wooden boards near my feet. Somewhere down the street a lawn-mower started humming, the ordinary sound of a neighbor taking care of their yard on a quiet Sunday. Life outside the house continued exactly as it always had, even while mine seemed to pause for a moment on that small patch of porch. I reached down and lifted the handle of the smaller suitcase, feeling its familiar weight as the wheels touched the boards with a soft rolling sound. The larger one was heavier, but I managed to pull it upright as well. Neither Daniel nor Ashley moved to help, though they both watched quietly as I gathered the bags. Before turning away, I looked once more through the doorway at the living room behind them. The photographs on the wall were still there, including the framed picture of Daniel at his college graduation, and the one of Robert standing beside the oak tree we planted in the backyard the year we bought this house. Those pictures represented decades of my life, yet at that moment they felt strangely distant, like scenes from someone else's story. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and stepped down from the porch onto the walkway, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes. The car sat where I had parked it only minutes earlier, though it felt like hours had passed since I first arrived home from church. I placed the smaller suitcase in the trunk and then carefully lifted the larger one beside it. When I closed the trunk lid and turned back toward the house, Daniel and Ashley were still standing in the doorway, watching silently as if they expected some final reaction from me. But there was nothing more to say. I simply walked around to the driver's side door, opened it, and sat down behind the wheel, realizing as I started the engine that for the first time in more than 30 years I was leaving that driveway without knowing when, or if I would ever return. I drove slowly down Maple Ridge Lane with both hands resting on the steering wheel, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space where my thoughts should have been. For several blocks I did not turn on the radio, and I did not reach for my phone. I simply drove, watching the familiar houses pass by one at a time, each front yard and mailbox looking exactly the same as they had for years. The strange part was not the drive itself, but the realization that I had nowhere specific to go. For more than 3 decades that house had been the place I returned to after every errand, every holiday dinner, every Sunday church service. Now, for the first time since Robert and I bought it, I was driving away without any plan at all. The afternoon sun shone through the windshield as I reached the end of the street and turned toward the main road that led through town. I noticed small details the way people do when their minds are searching for something steady to focus on. The gas station sign still showed the same prices it had that morning. The little diner on the corner had a few cars parked outside, and I could see someone inside pouring coffee at the counter. Everything around me continued as though nothing had changed. Yet my entire life had quietly shifted in the space of a single hour. I stopped at a red light near the grocery store and rested my hands in my lap for a moment while I waited. That was when I realized something important that had not occurred to me while I stood on the porch. Daniel and Ashley had packed my clothes and placed my suitcases outside, but they had not asked a single question about where I would go or how I would manage. The thought did not make me angry. Instead, it made me strangely curious, as if I were looking at a puzzle that had just revealed one of its missing pieces. I continued driving until I reached the small public park near the river, a quiet place where Robert and I used to walk in the evenings during the summer months. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle around me again. A few people were sitting on benches nearby, and a couple was slowly walking their dog along the paved path that followed the water. I remained in the car for a few minutes, staring through the windshield while the events of the afternoon replayed themselves in my mind. Ashley's calm voice, Daniel's silence, the note taped to the suitcase, and the new lock on the front door all formed a picture that was slowly becoming clearer the more I thought about it. Eventually I stepped out of the car and opened the trunk, so I could take a look inside the suitcases. The clothes were folded neatly, almost carefully, which told me that Ashley had probably done most of the packing. As I lifted a sweater from the top of the pile, I noticed something else resting at the bottom of the larger suitcase. It was a small folder made of thin brown cardboard, the kind people usually keep important papers in. For a moment I simply stared at it, trying to remember whether I had placed it there myself at some earlier time. I reached down and lifted the folder carefully, brushing a bit of lint from the cover as I opened it. Inside were several papers that I recognized immediately, documents I had not looked at in quite a while but had kept safely stored away for years. Seeing them again in that moment caused a slow understanding to spread through my mind, the kind that arrives quietly but changes everything once it appears. I closed the folder gently and held it in my hands while I looked out across the river, realizing that the story Daniel and Ashley believed they were writing might not turn out the way they expected at all. I sat on the bench beside the river with the brown folder resting quietly in my hands while the late afternoon light moved slowly across the water. The park had always been one of the calmest places in town, a place where Robert and I used to walk after dinner when the air cooled down in the evenings. Back then we would talk about small things like grocery lists, neighbors, or the weather, but sometimes we talked about more serious matters too, especially when Daniel was still young and we were thinking about the future. Holding that folder now brought those conversations back with surprising clarity. Robert had always been careful when it came to paperwork and planning. He believed that important decisions should be written down clearly so there would never be confusion later. After he passed away 8 years ago, I had spent a long afternoon with a lawyer reviewing everything we owned and making sure the documents were organized properly. At the time it had felt like a routine responsibility, the sort of thing people do simply because life moves forward and certain tasks must be handled. Now, sitting beside the river with my suitcases in the trunk of my car, those same papers felt very different. I opened the folder again slowly and looked at the first page. The familiar letterhead of the law office sat at the top, followed by lines of typed text that I had read before but had not thought about in years. The document confirmed something that Daniel and Ashley apparently did not understand when they placed my suitcases on the porch that morning. The house on Maple Ridge Lane had never been transferred to Daniel. It had remained entirely in my name ever since Robert and I purchased it more than 30 years earlier. Robert had insisted on that detail at the time, saying that a home should always remain secure for the person who lived there, no matter what changes might happen in the future. I traced my finger lightly along the edge of the page while the quiet sound of the river moved behind me. The realization did not make me feel triumphant or angry. Instead, it created a calm sense of clarity. Daniel and Ashley believed they had solved a problem by asking me to leave, but they had made that decision based on an assumption that was simply not true. I closed the folder again and rested it on my lap for a moment, while I thought about everything that had happened since that morning. Daniel had not looked comfortable standing in the hallway while Ashley spoke for both of them. There had been hesitation in his voice, even in the small nod he gave when I asked if he had written the note. That detail stayed with me as I sat there, watching the sunlight reflect across the river's surface. Eventually I stood up and walked back to the car, placing the folder carefully on the passenger seat before closing the door. For a few seconds I remained standing beside the vehicle, looking across the park and listening to the distant sound of children laughing near the playground. The world continued moving exactly as it always had, but inside my mind a new plan was beginning to take shape, one that required patience rather than anger. I started the engine again and pulled slowly out of the parking lot, knowing that the next few days would give me time to think clearly about what needed to happen next, and that the story Daniel and Ashley believed had already ended was only beginning to unfold. I drove for a while without choosing a direction, letting the quiet roads of town guide me while the late afternoon sun slowly lowered toward the horizon. The folder with the documents remained on the passenger seat beside me, and every time I glanced at it I felt the same calm certainty settle deeper in my mind. Daniel and Ashley had believed they were making a final decision that morning, but they had never stopped to ask a simple question about who actually owned the house they were living in. That detail alone changed the entire situation, yet I knew that reacting too quickly would not help anyone, especially not Daniel. My son had looked uncertain standing in that hallway, and that memory stayed with me as I drove past the small shops along Main Street and eventually pulled into the parking lot of a modest roadside motel just outside town. It was not a place I had ever planned to stay, but the building looked clean and quiet, and at that moment it offered something I needed more than anything else, which was time to think clearly. The clerk at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile and handed me a key card after I signed the small registration form. I carried the 2 suitcases down the short hallway and entered the room, setting the bags near the bed before closing the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of fresh laundry and cleaning soap, and the soft hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. For a few minutes I simply sat on the edge of the bed, letting the events of the day settle into place inside my thoughts. The quiet of the room allowed me to replay every detail from the moment I saw the suitcases on the porch to the moment I opened the folder beside the river. Eventually I stood and walked to the small table near the window, placing the brown folder carefully on the surface. I opened it again and looked through the papers one by one, making sure everything was still exactly the way the lawyer had organized it years earlier. The property documents clearly showed the address on Maple Ridge Lane, along with my name printed in full as the sole owner. There was no confusion about it and no additional signatures that might suggest anything had changed. Robert had always believed in keeping things simple and clear, and at that moment I felt grateful for the quiet wisdom behind that decision. I closed the folder again and leaned back in the chair, thinking about Daniel as a boy sitting at our kitchen table doing his homework while Robert read the newspaper nearby. He had always been thoughtful, sometimes even hesitant when making big decisions. That was why the silence I saw in him earlier felt so unusual. It suggested that the idea to push me out of the house had not fully come from him alone. Ashley had spoken with confidence, explaining their decision as if it were a practical step toward their future, yet I could not ignore the way Daniel had avoided meeting my eyes. The memory made me realize something important. If I responded with anger or accusations, Daniel might retreat even further into silence, allowing the situation to harden into something permanent. But if I approached the matter calmly and with patience, there might still be a way to make him see the truth of what had happened. I rested my hands on the table and looked at the folder one more time, understanding that these documents were more than just pieces of paper. They represented the stability Robert and I had built over decades, and they gave me the ability to decide how this situation would unfold next. Outside the motel window the sky had turned a soft shade of orange as evening approached, and I realized that the next steps I took would need to be careful, deliberate, and thoughtful if I wanted the story of this family to end differently than it had begun that Sunday afternoon. I woke up early the next morning in the quiet motel room, long before the sun had fully risen above the trees outside the window. For a few seconds I lay still, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a car passing on the highway. The events of the previous day returned to my mind slowly but clearly, just as they had happened. The suitcases on the porch, Ashley standing in the doorway, Daniel silent in the hallway, and the calm discovery of the documents beside the river. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt something different that morning. I felt prepared. I sat up and looked at the brown folder resting on the small table near the window. The papers inside it had not changed overnight, but my understanding of what they meant had grown stronger. I stood and walked over to the table, opening the folder again and carefully reading through the documents once more. The address of the house on Maple Ridge Lane appeared clearly at the top of the page, followed by the legal description of the property, and my name listed as the owner. There was no question about it. Robert and I had purchased that home together, and after he passed away the ownership had remained entirely with me. Daniel and Ashley had been living there because I welcomed them into my home, not because the house belonged to them. I closed the folder and placed it gently back on the table before walking to the window. Outside, the sky had begun to brighten with the pale colors of early morning, and a few birds were moving through the branches of a nearby tree. Watching them reminded me of something Robert used to say whenever life presented an unexpected problem. He always believed that the best decisions were made calmly and with patience, never in anger or frustration. That thought stayed with me as I prepared for the day. I took a shower, dressed carefully in a clean sweater and a pair of dark slacks, and packed the folder into my handbag so I could carry it with me. Before leaving the room, I paused for a moment and looked around the quiet space that had given me time to think clearly. It had not been home, but it had served its purpose. I checked out at the front desk and walked back to my car, placing the suitcases in the trunk just as I had done the day before. The morning air was cool and fresh, and as I started the engine I felt a quiet sense of direction settle inside me. Instead of driving aimlessly through town, I turned onto the main road and headed toward a familiar brick building near the courthouse square. The sign outside the office read Harper & Mills Legal Services, the same law firm Robert and I had visited years earlier when we organized our paperwork. When I stepped inside, the receptionist looked up from her desk with a polite smile. I explained that I had worked with their office before, and that I hoped to speak with someone about reviewing a few documents. Within a few minutes I was sitting in a comfortable chair across from Mr. Harper himself, who listened patiently while I explained the events of the previous afternoon. I did not raise my voice and I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I simply described the note, the suitcases on the porch, and the changed lock on the door of my house. When I finished speaking, I placed the brown folder on his desk and opened it so he could review the papers inside. Mr. Harper adjusted his glasses and read the documents carefully, nodding slowly as he confirmed what I already knew. After a moment he looked up at me and spoke in a calm professional tone, explaining that the law was very clear regarding property ownership, and that the situation could be addressed properly if I wished to move forward. I thanked him for his time and listened carefully as he outlined the steps that could be taken. When I left the office later that morning, the sun had climbed higher in the sky and the streets of town were beginning to fill with the ordinary activity of another weekday. As I walked back to my car, I understood that the quiet plan forming in my mind the night before was now becoming something real, and that the next time Daniel and Ashley saw me standing at the door of the house on Maple Ridge Lane, the conversation would unfold very differently than it had the day before. I returned to Maple Ridge Lane 3 days later just after 10 o'clock in the morning, the same quiet street looking exactly as it always had with the tall oak trees casting soft shadows across the pavement and the familiar houses sitting peacefully beside one another. Anyone driving past would have thought it was just another ordinary weekday, but for me the moment carried a quiet sense of resolution that had taken shape over the last few days. I parked my car along the curb instead of in the driveway and turned off the engine, taking a slow breath while I looked at the house that Robert and I had bought together more than 30 years earlier. The white porch railing was still there. The flower bed I planted near the walkway was still blooming gently in the late morning sun, and the rocking chair sat exactly where it had been when I left. Nothing about the place itself had changed, yet the meaning of that house had become clearer to me than it had ever been before. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front gate, carrying my handbag over my shoulder with the brown folder resting safely inside. As I approached the porch I could hear faint movement inside the house, the quiet sound of footsteps crossing the living room floor. I raised my hand and knocked calmly on the door. It took a few seconds before the door opened, and when it did Ashley stood there again just as she had the Sunday before. Her expression shifted slightly when she saw me standing on the porch, not with suitcases this time but with the same calm composure I had carried with me all week. Behind her, Daniel appeared again in the hallway, his posture tense the moment he recognized me at the door. For a moment none of us spoke, and the silence felt almost identical to the one we had shared days earlier, except this time I understood something they did not. I greeted them politely and explained that I had come to discuss something important regarding the house. Ashley seemed ready to repeat the same explanation she had given before, but I gently raised my hand and asked if they would allow me a moment to speak first. Daniel nodded slowly, and I reached into my handbag and removed the brown folder before opening it carefully so the documents inside could be seen clearly. I explained that after Robert passed away I had worked with a lawyer to organize all of our paperwork, including the ownership of the house. I then placed the top page in Ashley's hands, so she could read the printed name beside the property address. The quiet that followed was different from the silence we had shared before. This time it was filled with realization. Ashley looked down at the page and then toward Daniel, her expression shifting from confidence to confusion as she understood what the document clearly stated. Daniel stepped closer and read the same line, his shoulders lowering slightly as the truth settled in. I did not raise my voice and I did not accuse either of them of anything. I simply explained that the house had always remained in my name, and that their ability to live there had existed only because I had welcomed them into my home. For several seconds Daniel said nothing, but eventually he looked up at me with the same uncertain expression I had noticed days earlier. The difference now was that the situation was finally clear to everyone standing on that porch. I told them calmly that I had not returned to argue or cause trouble. I had returned because the home Robert and I built together still belonged to me, and decisions about it would always begin with that simple fact. The breeze moved lightly through the oak trees as Daniel stood quietly holding the document, and in that moment I realized that the power in the situation had shifted without a single raised voice. The story that began with my suitcases sitting on the porch had come full circle, and the future of that house on Maple Ridge Lane would now be decided with the truth clearly in front of all of us.